Well, I'm happy to be here again. And for those of you who were here last year, I'm going to tell you in the beginning that it's pretty much the same old story. Maybe you will have forgotten some of it. Hopefully we'll find it interesting again. Most of you know I spent most of my life in the jewelry business. So what am I doing talking about antique cars? And that's a good question. And the answer is that I was raised in a small town over here at Manchester. My father was affiliated and associated with a small town garage and machine shop. And the man with whom he worked had two sons, one just older and one just younger than I am. There were no programs to keep school kids busy after school or during the summer. And so our fathers permitted us to play around and work in that garage. They also sold cars. And my father was chief salesman. But it was during that era of my life that I realized that cars were improving and that people, to some degree, bought cars in the 20s based on what they were willing to put up with, because all cars gave trouble of one nature or another. Of course, mankind has always dreamed of a self-propelled vehicle. Attempts were made, articles were written, and hopes were raised in the 16 and 1700s. But of course, they didn't have the technology, nor the roads, nor the real need for a horseless carriage. In 1860, steam power was new. Oh, they'd always had steam, but to harness it was fairly new. And a man whose name was Oliver Evans was commissioned by the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to build a steam-powered river dredge. Of course, he built this in his machine shop, which was not on the bank of the river, nor was it near the harbor. And he had the ingenuity that it took to load that barge onto a wagon chassis, rig up a belt, and attach it to the engine, a pulley, and he drove that steam-powered river dredge through the streets of Philadelphia. Well, he had somewhat of a sense of humor, because he caught on to the fact that people were coming to the windows to see what in the world Oliver Evans was doing out there. He's driving along on this farm wagon powered by a river dredge. It was important enough, and it attracted enough attention, that the county commissioners told him to drive that thing to the river and launch it before it blew up and killed somebody, maybe even them. And so that's what they did. But as far as I know, that was the first self-propelled vehicle ever driven in America. Now there's another part to the story that you will find all but unbelievable, but it's true. Europe, especially England, well, and Germany, was way ahead of the United States because they were an older country. They were ahead of the United States in such areas as building a horseless carriage. And in about 1830, I said 1830, there were buses running up and down the trails in England carrying passengers. One man by the name of Church built a bus in those days that would carry 42 passengers, 21 upstairs and 21 downstairs. They'd been using these things for years, 27 years in fact. But they were naturally cutting in on the business of horse-drawn vehicles and horse-drawn buses and other horse-drawn conveyances. And so Parliament, in all of its wisdom, passed a law. And it said that no self-propelled vehicle could go down the road at a speed of more than 3 miles an hour. 27 years after the fact. No self-propelled vehicle can go down the road at a speed of more than 3 miles an hour. And get this, and then only if preceded by a man waving a red flag. Needless to say, that pretty well stopped the development of self-propelled conveyances in Europe. That law. That law was not repealed until I believe it was 1865, when America began to show some interest and some talent in the area of developing a horseless carriage. Can you imagine that? That would be almost as bad as telling us here tonight that we'd have to stop using television because it hurts our eyes. But that's what they did. And in many respects, American industry can be thankful that that law was passed, because we were not yet ready to get serious about building cars. See, this was the Civil War period, and we were busy building guns, and you know the story. But since they hobbled themselves, you might say, for a period of years, well, until 1865, it gave us a chance to get our business taken care of here and get into the business of building cars. That is a true story. One of those buses blew up in 1833. It blew up in Glasgow, Scotland, and it killed a few people. And some say that the whole thing was schemed or rigged in order to give Parliament a foundation on which to stand in eliminating the use of steam-powered vehicles, except under the conditions that I have mentioned. But anyhow, that's the way it was. So let's get back to America. Now, at this period of time, bicycles were very common. Those big high-wheelers, bicycles of all kinds. And there were bicycle dealers in town, as we have car dealers in town. And it would follow that people who were interested in building bicycles would have some interest in developing a horse-drawn or a horseless carriage. And there were two brothers in Springfield, Massachusetts. They were Frank and Charles Duryea. They operated a bicycle shop which happened to have 2 stories. And when they could find the time, they would go upstairs and work on their self-propelled vehicle. Frank was really the mechanic. Charles was the promoter. And Charles became discouraged with their progress, or lack of it, and so he sought another job and left town. Frank was somewhat sickly in that he had a chronic illness. And so he got to tinkering with this car that they'd started, this horseless carriage. And the main trouble with it, it was a gasoline engine, and the main trouble with it was that he couldn't figure out a way to vaporize gasoline, because gasoline has to be vaporized before it will serve the purpose that it serves in motivating your car. And then you women came into the picture, in that one night they were getting ready to go out socially, and he noticed his wife with a little handheld vaporizer, spraying cologne or whatever. And the idea struck him. If I can vaporize that with a contraption of that caliber, I can get that engine to run. I guess he went on to the part third, but from that time on, he started working on a vaporizer. And he got it perfected to some degree. And on September the 22nd, 1893, he lowered this self-propelled vehicle down onto the main floor, rolled it out into the street, started the engine, and drove it 200 feet. And he got out, of course, or off, and did a little adjusting and drove it a little further. Now, as a youngster growing up, I would have thought that an occasion like this would call for a celebration, maybe even a parade. Hooray, at last we've got self-propelled transportation. Didn't happen that way. People are too smart. You know what they did? They started passing laws to inhibit the use of an automobile. They scared chickens. They scared horses. They made a racket. And if you parked one on a macadamized street, it would probably leak gasoline, and consequently a little hole would develop in the paving. There was every reason in the world not to let that car thing get out of hand. In Springfield, Massachusetts, one had to attach a bell to the wheel of the car in a manner that would cause it to ring with every revolution of the wheel. And that, of course, was to warn a pedestrian of the fact that a dangerous car was nearby. Another area passed a law which made it against the law to put a vehicle on a barge with gasoline in the tank. So you had to drive up to the riverbank, drain the gas out of the tank, roll the car onto the barge, I guess hold the gasoline out over the water so if it started to burn you could drop it, and reverse all of that when you got to the other side. Oh, those people in those days were really smart. Some of us might not be here tonight had it not been for their looking out after us. I think the craziest law of all of them, and there's no end. Well, in a town in Nebraska, South Dakota, in Mitchell, South Dakota, a town of 10,000 people, with all of the amenities that towns of 10,000 have, churches, had a college, a university, everything. In all of their wisdom, they saw fit to make it against the law to own a self-propelled vehicle, even if you had it locked in the garage behind your house. Against the law. Well, that's pretty far out. But the best one was the Roman candle law. And that law said that if you were driving a vehicle, you had to carry with you at all times a supply of Roman candles. And if you saw an approaching horse and rider or driver in the distance, you lit a candle and shot it into the air. If the man on the horse raised his hand one time it meant stop the forward motion of the car. If he raised his hand twice, it meant shut off the engine. The racket is scaring my horse. If he raised his hand 3 times, too late. Too late. You were supposed to hide your car in the weeds to whatever extent possible in order to let the horse and driver pass. That was the greeting that the automobile had in the very beginning. And this was in the 1800s, the late 1800s, 1893 in fact, and along in there. The Duryea brothers built, I believe it was 13 cars. But they didn't envision what you and I have seen. They didn't envision universal usage of this car. They were really rich men's toys because there were no roads. No, they just weren't ready for cars. But they built 13 of them and sold them for rich men's toys. And then they got into an argument. I've already told you they were brothers. They got into an argument over which of the two had really made the greatest contribution toward building the horseless carriage that they had built. And they couldn't agree on that. So they parted company. And one of them, I believe it was Charles, lived until the 1960s. And he therefore had the privilege, if that's what it was, of seeing this stream of cars go by, realizing that he and his brother were the first people to have done that. And also realizing what it had cost them in money and fame and all that goes with being successful, to have fallen out over such a trivial thing as who did the most. And so neither of them ever really profited from having built America's first self-propelled gasoline conveyance. Well, I haven't mentioned Henry Ford yet. By the way, as I've told you, England rescinded their red flag law in 1865. It was 2 years after the Duryea brothers had built their first car. They celebrated in England by having car races and big to-do over having rescinded that law. And the Duryea brothers shipped cars over there. And because of their advancement, or the advancement they had made, while those people were asleep, the Duryea brothers won all the marbles. They won everything they entered because they had superior machines. Now, Henry Ford was raised on a farm 9 or 10 miles from the city limits of Detroit. That is, the city limits of Detroit when he was a boy. He had some brothers and sisters, a mother and a father, but he didn't fit in on the farm. He didn't like the farm. But they did discover that he was pretty good at keeping the machinery running. And so his father agreed to let him go into town and serve an apprenticeship as a machinist in one of the machine shops there in Detroit. And Henry had an aptitude for that sort of thing, and so he went to town and served that apprenticeship. As a sidelight, while he was there, he struck up an acquaintance with a jeweler, or at least a watch repairman. And during evenings, Henry would spend his time with this watch repair person, and that person taught Henry the basics of repairing watches. And so in addition to all of Henry Ford's other accomplishments, he was also a watch repair person, or could have been. And one story that I read said that he kept a watch repair bench and the necessary tools there at the factory. And that on one occasion, I believe it was one of the presidents, was walking through and he'd lost the crown off of the watch where you wind it, and Henry picked up the crown and went to his repair bench and put it back on there, and of course repaired the watch for the visiting dignitary, whomever it was. But in any event, he wanted to get into the car business. He, however, after he'd served his apprenticeship, he went back. He couldn't find a job, and he didn't have any money with which to build a car. And he was floundering, and his dad said, "Son, why don't you come back to the farm, and we'll clear the South 40, and you can marry Clara Bryant, who just lived down the road a ways, and they knew each other and had been interested in each other before, and you can settle down to lead the life of a gentleman farmer, which your heritage entitles you to do." Now, all of you fellows have been the age that Henry was in those days, and we all agree that that was a pretty good proposition. Get your own farm, going to build a house, and marry Clara. How can you beat it? So Henry took him up on it. And all of this was accomplished. And then a German came to town with an engine that he had built, and this man's name was Otto. And he was displaying his Otto engine, not automobile engine, but the Otto engine that was built by Mr. Otto. And Henry went to town to see the engine. They say that the biggest difference between the Otto engine and others was that his engine had a better muffler, and that was an attractive feature, of course. But Henry went to town to see that engine and to hear it run. And I guess the smell of grease and gasoline and all of that was too much for him to overcome. So he went back home and said, "Clara, pack your clothes. We're moving to town." And so they moved to town in a little brick house on Bagley Avenue in Detroit. And he worked for the Detroit Edison Electric Company as an engineer. But during his spare time, in a little brick building that might have been a carriage house on Bagley Avenue, he started building a car. And the first thing he built was the engine. And he used sections of galvanized pipe for the cylinders, and it was a crude affair, but when he finally got it finished, it was, again, an evening before they were going out for some kind of entertainment. And Henry had this thing bolted to a piece of wood like a 2x12, and he had Clara hold it down in the kitchen sink. And he was so eager to see if it was at last going to run that he pulled the string and it started, and Henry had a gasoline engine. And he went ahead and finished the car and built it there in that little building. It is true that the car that he built was bigger than the opening in the building. And so they had to tear a section of the wall out in order to extricate the car so they could drive it. He got this thing finished in June. I think it was June the 12th, 1893. Now, June the 12th, 18... Well, anyhow, I'll think of it in a minute. And it was at 2 o'clock in the morning. So he and his friends rolled this thing out into the street, hung a lantern over the front of it, and he drove it around the block in the rain. Now, can you imagine asleep on a June night, raining, ideal conditions for sleeping? Here goes this young whippersnapper, Henry Ford, playing with one of his toys, driving it around the block. Well, when he got back, somebody said, "What do you think of it, Henry?" And he said, "The only thing I've got to say is it sure makes a lot of noise." And he was right about that. But he still wasn't in the car business. There were other cars by now. One of them was being built by King, of the King Motor Company, and he had a pretty sophisticated car. But Henry drove his car to town, and he was all but forced to take it back home. People pulled pranks on him. They'd lift it, set it on the sidewalk, and he'd have to manage to get it back into the street by himself. They'd drain the gas out of it. They complained, and he had to get a special permit from the mayor of Detroit to give him the authority to drive his car to town. And so we can say that Henry Ford was the first person in America ever to have a driver's license. And it was issued by the mayor of Detroit. Mr. King's car was a good car, but he didn't get very far. Henry continued his job, piddling with his car, and other car people were entering races, contests of various sorts, because competition was what it took to prove the worth of a car in those days. It wasn't how well does it ride, how comfortable is it. None of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was, could it climb a steeper hill than the other man's car? There are even pictures of cars being driven up the steps in Washington, D.C. to demonstrate how agile they were and how well they could climb. And so that's what other people were building cars for. But Henry Ford saw it differently. He said at a later date that the first person that could build a car that a 15-year-old boy could keep running with a roll of wire and a pair of pliers would have a path beaten to his door. And that was the car that Henry wanted to build. But he's still not in business. However, the Winton people are building some pretty fast cars, and they issued a challenge to anybody to show up at Grosse Pointe, Michigan for a race on a given day. Well, several cars showed up, I think 5 or 6, but only 2 of the entrants could get their car started when it was time to start. And so Henry and the Winton people were the only ones that could get to going. Now, actually, there were 2 races, and I didn't relate the first one last year, but I'm going to this time. Henry showed up with a car that had 2 cylinders, and it was what we call a square engine because the bore and the stroke were the same. 2 cylinders, almost 600 cubic inches of displacement. The bore was 6.9 inches, and so was the stroke. The car weighed 2,300 pounds. The engine weighed 835 or 40. So the engine weighed 1/3 of the total car. But Henry had never driven a race car. And he's very nervous about it. Oh, he don't mind the straightaway, but those curves frightened him. Well, a friend of his who was a 6-day bicycle race rider's name was Tommy Cooper. And he got Tommy to ride a few rounds with him around this dirt racetrack to show him kind of how to come out of those dangerous curves and whatever else he could show him in the short time they had to learn to drive this car. Well, the Winton, was pretty sophisticated. It was built to race, and it was sort of streamlined and much bigger in overall dimension. But Henry had to win the race, and had to run the race regardless of his fears. And they were going to give Waterford glass trophies, and they had several pieces of the expensive Waterford glassware. And among the pieces to be selected from was a punch bowl complete with cups and tray. And Henry's rig looked so sorry that the people who were promoting the race let the Winton people pick which of those prizes they wanted after the race was won, and they picked the punch bowl. Henry got a guy's name, his first name was Jiggs. I don't know what his last name was, but he built a little platform on the side of his racing car, and he had Jiggs kind of ride on that board in a hunkered down position, And the idea was to add weight to that side of the car so it wouldn't turn over as they went around those corners. The race was on. The Winton jumped out in front. Henry could keep up with him pretty well on the straightaway. But when it came to the curves, he'd shut off the engine because he's afraid to drive it as fast as it run. He'd coast around the curve and turn her on again, and of course the momentum of the car would cause the engine to start, and away he'd go. Oh, it was comical until the 8th round, and the Winton engine began to smoke. And what had been planned to be a 25-lap race only lasted 10 laps, and Henry Ford won the race. Not because he had such a fast car, but because he had endurance, and he outlasted the Winton. And by the way, the average speed that day was 44 8/10 miles per hour. Well, the Winton people were embarrassed. They said, wait till next year, same time, same place. We'll be here. Bring on the best you've got. We'll show you what a race car is really like. So they all showed up again next year, and Henry was there. But he'd learned something. He'd learned something. He had a better car. He had an inline 4-cylinder engine that displaced about 1,000 inches, steered with a tiller. He had already decided that he would not drive it, but Mr. Cooper knew about Barney Oldfield. Barney Oldfield was another bicycle race rider. So they got in touch with Barney, and he said, well, I've never driven one of those contraptions, but if it's as much fun to race on a car as it is to race on a bicycle, I'll give it all I've got. So he showed up for the race, and they let him drive this 999, that was what they called that car. They let him drive old 999 up and down the backside of the racetrack for a day or two, because they didn't want the Winton people to know what they had. And the day of the race came, and Harvey Firestone, who had built the tires, was there, and there were some other dignitaries, and Henry actually cranked the car. Barney sits on this gas tank with a cigar. His trademark was a cigar cocked at a jaunty angle in his mouth. And he said, well, you tell my friends if this thing kills me that I was having a good time when it happened. And they fired the gun, and old 999 jumped out in front of the Bullet, the Winton Bullet, and 999 outran the Winton Bullet a distance of a half a mile on a 3-mile track. And so that race, the second of Henry's experiences, really did attract people to him, interested in investing money in a motor car company. So his first race was 1901, his second race was 1902, and they launched the Ford Motor Company in 1903. And he did it with money from people who had known about the races and felt like that he had a future ahead of him. The first president of the Ford Motor Company was a man whose name was Gray. Mr. Gray was the president of the Daisy Air Rifle Company, but he had some money, and he had more than anybody else apparently to invest. And so he was the chief investor, and he was therefore the first president of the Ford Motor Company. Another man by the name of Cousins, who worked for a coal dealer, invested some money, and there were others. But Henry was the vice president, and his salary was $3,000 a year. Well, he started building these cars, and they didn't have much of a system worked out for building them. They just were putting them together. And they built a few, and every year, Henry would try to simplify his car at a time when everybody else was making theirs more complicated and more enjoyable. But he was simplifying his. And he built 5 models before he got to the Model T. And each one, as I've said, a little simpler than the one before. But they were selling for $800 and $900. And he realized that that was a little much for to sell to people that would be buying that kind of a car, he realized that $800 or $900 was more money than his employees could pay for a car. And he thought it would be only fair if the person who worked on a Model T could make enough money to buy a Model T if he wanted to. And that was a pretty nice thing for him to come up with. And he wanted his employees to be able to live as good a life as anybody. So he started working on the assembly line. Now, there were other assembly lines before Henry Ford developed his. Meat packing companies, of course, used lines. The Waltham Watch Factory had a line. But everybody took the man to the job, and the job sat still. Henry figured out that you would take the job to the man, and the man would stand still. He got that perfected in 1913. He kept telling his employees when he would make a change, in what he was doing, bear with me, I'm doing this for your benefit. And if you'll stay with me, we'll get this thing worked out. And they finally did. And until he had perfected his assembly line, it took 12 hours to build a Model T. 12 hours. After he turned the last tap in his adjustments, they could build a Model T Ford in an hour and a half. Isn't that something? 10 and a half hours off the schedule. And so once that was done, he announced in January of 1914 that every worker's wages would be doubled from $2.50 a day to $5. And the Wall Street Journal, the bankers, and that everybody that had anything to do with industry accused Henry of bringing ruination to the industrial world, because nobody could afford to pay that kind of money for assembly line workers. And the next week, the next Monday morning, 10,000 people were assembled outside Ford Motor Company, there to apply for a job. Well, Henry, in 1908, had come up with about as simple a car as he could imagine. He was going to call it the Model T. You may remember the Model T looks something like this. This is a Model T Ford. He got down to the Model T. Now, on the first 22 or 2300 Model Ts, he had a water pump on the engine. He had a compression ratio of 7 or 8 to 1. And this high lever that's here on the left of the driver's position was to put it in high, and then there was a second lever there to serve as an emergency brake. So, after the first 22 or 2300, he took the water pump off the engine, he lowered the compression ratio, and he put the emergency brake on the counterclockwise angle of the high lever. In other words, you pull it back from vertical and you had applied the emergency brake. Push it forward and you'd put it in high. And when he got that done, he said, that's as simple as I can make it. And starting in October, I believe it was October the 27th, he started building that Model T in 1908. He built it until May of 1927, and I think it was the 31st day of May. And during that time, he built 15,007,033 Model T Fords. They made a few differences from time to time in the body, but the chassis and the engine and all of that remained virtually unchanged during all of those 19 years. Unfortunately, Henry didn't have what it took to see that the sliding gear transmission and the various other improvements that General Motors had been making on their cars over the years had all but made his Model T Ford a thing of the past. a lot of the people who worked for him realized that that was happening. And one time, while he was gone on a vacation, they built a prototype of a pretty decent little car, although it could probably have been called a Model T. And when Henry got back from vacation, they took him down to show him what they had built, because sales were falling. And he took a sledgehammer and beat that car all to pieces. That's not just something I read in a paperback magazine. I have a book at home called Ford, The Men and the Machine. The Ford Motor Company told me that I could quote anything in that book as being correct, and that story is in that book. On another time, he had turned the company over to Edsel, and Edsel started building a new building. And in that building was going to be a bookkeeping department, and Henry Ford didn't like bookkeepers. And he made Edsel tear the building down and fill in the basement and plant grass. He wouldn't permit a nice building for the accounting department to work in. And there are more stories than that. But in any event, they quit building cars in 1927 with no plans on the trestle board. No, not the foggiest notion of what they were going to do next. And Edsel came up with the Model A. And in general terms, you will recall that the Model A looked something like this. It didn't have these big wheels, but looked like this car. It was really just a glorified Model T. It was still a 4-cylinder engine. And they built that car for 4 years. They built a 28 model, a 29, a 30, and a 31. And it was a good car, and it filled many of the spaces of many of the purposes of Model T Ford. But it had a little better engine, and it rode a little better, and it would run 65 miles an hour and all of those things. But unfortunately, in 1929, which was the second year that Ford produced Model A's, in 1929, Chevrolet came out with a 6-cylinder engine. And that put the Model A Ford on the back burner. And they had to quit making the Model A and with the end of the 1931 run. And of course, in 32, they came out with the Ford V8. And there again, Ford products went to the forefront because he was the only person building a V8 car that people like you and I could afford. And it was a very popular automobile, and they sold about all of them that they could make. They made a 4-cylinder car that year also, and they called it the Model B, but it was the only difference between it and a V8 was the engine. At another point in time, Henry stockholders became unhappy with him for building such a simple car when Buick and others were building better machines. And so for a year, Henry Ford built a 6-cylinder car. And this was in the year of 1906. And he built 1,699 of those cars. It was called the Tourer. And as I've said, it had 6 cylinders. And it sold for considerably more money. I think it sold for $2,200. But that was enough of that. He convinced his stockholders that that was not the way for them to go. And so he got back to the Model T and eventually the Model A and then the V8. Henry didn't like unions. He didn't like Jewish people. And he, in his older years, he was afraid that unions and the Jewish people would take over his factory. And in 1946, he hired a known underworld leader to take over the Ford Motor Company. See to it that the Jewish people, that Wall Street and the unions don't get a foothold in this company. That was the only instruction that he gave him. Well, of course, this man brought in his cohorts. He'd put maybe Freddie here in charge of buying upholstery, and before Freddie would buy any upholstery from anybody, they'd have to kick in $500,000 to the Detroit Lions, my favorite baseball team. It got to where Ford was losing millions of dollars. But there was no changing his mind. People were carrying guns in the Ford Motor Company. There were only 3 or 4 people from the old school. Everybody else was new. If they saw 2 men talking over here on the assembly line, the bouncer would go over and beat the daylights out of them because they would assume they were complaining about the way the thing was being run. It was far worse than was ever printed in the papers. The Ford Motor Company still had some unfilled orders for the United States government even then. And so the government intervened and they persuaded Henry Ford II, who was Henry Ford's grandson, to take over the Ford Motor Company. And he said, well, I'll only do it under one condition, and that is that we get rid of Granddad. And Clara said, I'll get rid of Granddad. And so that was worked out, and some of you older people, not as old as I am, but some of you older ones may remember there's quite a bit of talk in the late 40s about this young Henry Ford and the egghead team that he brought with him. He brought 8 or 10 outstanding university students with him to help manage the Ford Motor Company. And they got it turned around and they got to building some new models. They actually had a withdrawal of guns in order to settle this. But they convinced Henry Bennett, that was the underworld figure, they convinced old Henry that he'd milked it for far more than he was entitled to. And in the interest of everybody concerned, he'd ought to pack up and move out. And he did. And then at a later date, contenders from both sides met up at Henry Bennett's summer home. And they got to talking about old times, and they got to drinking. And the officers found him the next morning out in the yard, drunk, beat up, and all of that. One of the interests that I have is the fact that this thing that we take for granted, and this automobile that's so important to us, had such an humble and such a feeble beginning. And that it all started with people no smarter than you and I. They just were the right people at the right time who could see the need. And I'm grateful to them for having done what they did. The laws that I mentioned, as I said in the beginning, when the time for something has come, you can't keep it from coming. It's planned. It was to have been that way, and that's the way it was with the car. This 3 mile an hour speed limit and all of that, of course, was based on the speed that a horse could walk. And they could see the economy was geared to 3 miles an hour. So they could see no reason to have anything going any faster. And in Chicago, Illinois, you could drive a car, but not faster than 3 miles an hour. And just to be darn sure you didn't, Sue, you know what they did? They bought a bunch of bicycles. The police department bought a bunch of bicycles with which to enforce the speed limit of cars. You talk about having things backwards. That's the way it was. But we know what happened since then, and we're all glad of it. Now, I've spoken for almost an hour. I haven't touched on General Motors, but I don't want to bore you. You want to hear about General Motors, or are you through?
That's on your Tucker.
Well, I'll get on that in a minute. We'll do that after intermission. The pay is the same that I mentioned earlier. I might intervene here or inject here a little story I heard to kind of lighten things up a little about this older gentleman. Was a little discouraged with the way things were going in life, especially between he and his wife. They were in their 50s, early 60s. So he decided to take her to a psychiatrist to see what had come over her in her thinking and decisions and all of that. So he takes her to the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist listens to their tales of woe, after which he gets up and just goes right over and plants a big kiss on the wife of the complainer. He said, Mr. Jones, that's the kind of treatment your wife needs about twice a week. Jones said, "That won't be any trouble. Easy to fix, and if it's all right with you, I'll have her in here every Tuesday and every Thursday." Okay, leave if you want to. Billy Durant was quite an entrepreneur. He contributed as much, maybe more, to the automobile world than did Henry Ford. He started out selling shoe polish, and he had an uncle who owned a string of lumber yards, and the uncle said, "Billy, anytime you want to go to work for me, you just pick the yard you want to work in." Well, Billy picked the biggest yard they had because he assumed that he would go in as manager. Fully qualified, of course. But the job involved stacking lumber. Now, I've worked in a lumber yard, and I know what stacking lumber amounts to. It ain't fun. Well, he didn't stay with that very long, but he was approached by a man that was selling buggies, horse-drawn buggies. And he thought he could do a better job than the salesman was doing, and he wound up building and selling horse-drawn carriages. Doing quite well. The books say that at one time, Billy Durant was one of the wealthier men in Detroit, Michigan. Billy Durant, William Crapo Durant. He was raised in a home wherein the father was alcoholic, and he didn't have any of the privileges that he might have had. And then he heard about this car coming to town. He heard about Henry Ford's driver's license, and he heard about all of that stuff. And somebody right there in the neighborhood had the audacity to buy one of those noisy contraptions and drive it home. And he was taking the kids in the neighborhood a ride. Durant wouldn't let his kids ride in that car because it represented a financial threat. And then he got thinking better about it. And he decided to get into the car business. He approached Henry Ford. He had already made some plans to take over the Ford Motor Company, and Henry was amenable to the idea because Henry Ford had a very limited formal education, 3rd or 4th grade. I have written letters that Henry wrote, and he could express himself vaguely. But to manage a thing as big as the Ford Motor Company was becoming, and dealing with the people, and dealing with the union, and dealing with all of that, he wasn't equipped for it. At this point in time, he had a cot in his office where he could lie down and rest during the day, and he was not an old man. So he was willing to sell out. And the deal, I think, was going to be around $8 million, and that wouldn't be a bad sum to retire on. But anyhow, the deal fell through. And so Durant went on down the road, and he bought Buick and Cadillac and Oldsmobile. And with those 3 cars, Billy Durant started General Motors. Now, he also bought another car or 2, but he didn't put the other 2 cars in the General Motors family. One of the cars he bought was the Little car. That was the name of it, Little, L-I-T-T-L-E. The Little car. There's one of them in Minden, Nebraska in the museum. With Buick, Durant inherited Lewis Chevrolet. Lewis was a fine mechanic, as were his 2 brothers. But with the Little car, Durant said, "You take the Little car down to the Round Top and see if you can't make something more out of it than it is at this time. And we'll figure out what we're going to do with it at a later date." So they did this. And by the way, Durant told him, "To show you how much I appreciate what you're going to do, not only will I pay you a salary, but we'll change the name of the car to Chevrolet." And as far as I know, Lewis Chevrolet never received one dime for the use of his name, other than the honor of seeing it on all of those radiators. So he went down there and he developed this car. Well, Durant started General Motors in 1908. This is the year Henry started building the Model T Ford. But he didn't get along very well with his stockholders. I'm speaking of Durant. And so by 1910, they fired him. He goes back down to the Round Top. Helps a little more with the developing of this Chevrolet car. He caught Louis Chevrolet smoking a cigar in the office one day, which was a no-no. And he was about ready to fire the guy anyhow because they were ready to do something with this car, and who wants a partner, you know? And so he fired Louis Chevrolet. And in 1916, and for a while he built Chevrolet cars. And until about 1916, you bought a Chevrolet from the Chevrolet Motor Car Company, not from General Motors. And this old Chevrolet that belongs to Wayne Kinsey was built by the Chevrolet Motor Car Company. So, 1908, they start General Motors. 1910, they kick Billy Durant out. 1916, he takes this Chevrolet that they've developed back to General Motors. They were selling enough of them that General Motors gave him again controlling interest in General Motors for that Chevrolet car. And they were already building Buick, an Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. So they thought enough of it. It was the overwhelming popular car of the day, this Chevrolet. But again, he went to California one day and bought a tractor company that he hadn't talked to the stockholders about. It was the Sampson Tractor Company. And he came home and told them what he'd done, and he did a few other foolish things like that. And so 1920, they fired him again. And this time Billy Durant started still a third company. And the name of that company was the Durant Motor Car Company. And he built Star and Reliance and 2 or 3 other name brands. He even exported cars that he was building. At this time, he was not manufacturing the cars. They were assembled cars. He was buying Continental engines, Briggs & Stratton parts, Delco Remy ignition, Kelsey Hayes wheels, Harrison radiators, putting that all together. And the car that he sold mostly in this part of the country was the Star. And my father sold Star cars, and they competed with Chevrolet and other cars in that general price range. But the Depression came along in the 30s, and he sold out, Durant sold out, and in fact he went broke. But he did 2 other things that showed that he had a lot of vision. One of them was that he had the world's first grocery supermarket. He built a supermarket in Detroit, Michigan, but it was ahead of its time. He was also the first person ever to build a bowling alley of the size and magnitude that we have in these days. But when he died absolutely penniless. I'm talking about the guy that founded General Motors. He died penniless, living in a hotel in Detroit, Michigan that had been named in his honor when he was living in better days. Henry Ford centralized power. He held the whole thing in the palm of his hand. The book that I've already mentioned says that Henry Ford killed his son by giving him responsibilities and then breathing down his neck, trying to control what he did and didn't do. But he centralized power. Billy Durant took just the opposite point of view. He decentralized. He's the one that established the family of cars and all of these satellite companies that make up a part of General Motors, like Delco Remy, AC spark plugs, Kelsey Hayes wheels, Harrison radiators, Timken bearings, all of those companies to feed General Motors. And they all, of course, operated at a profit. What an insight, what a vision that he had. And so those 2 stories pretty well represent how we got all this started and how we got to where we are today. Now, some of you may remember, do any of you remember the Tucker automobile that was the talk of the town in the late 40s?
Of the movie. I say I have the movie and all.
Well, okay, I'd
It's
forgotten
live.
about that. Preston Tucker decided to build a car with which to compete with the big names in the late 40s. He didn't have any money, but he had a plant in Chicago, Illinois. And he took orders from people like you and me with a cash down payment. And that money that we sent in was to help him finance the building of his car. And he had a lot of undeveloped ideas. It was to have been a rear engine car. You were supposed to have been able to go by the car dealership this morning on the way to work and have them give you a loaner engine to use while they repaired your engine, and that was to take no longer than 30 minutes to make that exchange. The engine, as I've said, was to be in the rear. There was to have been a Cyclops eye in the front, and that was to turn with the steering wheel, so you could see going around a corner. It had a suicide door on the back, conventional doors on the front. And down in here, he didn't have a glove compartment, but he just had a big open space that was padded with rubber. And the idea there was that if you saw a crash coming and you were riding on the passenger side, you could hunker down and bounce into that rubber compartment and hopefully not be killed. Anybody else?
Bob, I've still got a Jeep that Dad bought in 1946, a CJ2A. It's out in the barn for $645, brand new, right after the war.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You probably remember it, but I still have a 1924 Reneau Speedwagon truck.
I didn't realize that.
Yes.
Will it run?
Yes. It's just sitting out here another mile south.
How come you don't have it in the parade?
Will be probably next year.
Oh, the real Speedwagon was really something. Anybody else? Well, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.